Something has been bubbling under the surface of WNBA broadcasts this season, and a lot of casual fans missed it entirely. The league's most famous player kept absorbing hits that looked, frame by frame, like they belonged in a different sport, shoved off screens, knocked to the floor, caught with contact that lingered a beat too long to be incidental. The whistles came late. The league's public response stayed muted. And the people who watch closely enough to notice started asking the same question on a loop. When does somebody actually say something about this? Then something happened that nobody predicted. The loudest voices weren't inside the WNBA at all. They came from across the league line, from the NBA, men with no professional obligation to comment on a sport they don't play, who started weighing in anyway, one at a time, until the response itself became a story. Some defended Caitlin Clark like family. Others picked a rival instead and let the silence around her name speak for itself. What played out over a few months looked less like a wave of compliments and more like a referendum, and by the time it was done, the league's biggest stars had split visibly down the middle. The hit that forced the issue, this wasn't abstract. The flashpoint that pulled outside commentary into the open was a real, documented incident. During a Fever Mercury game this past week, Phoenix forward Alyssa Thomas made contact with Clark's throat area in a play that went uncalled in real time. The league reviewed it afterward, upgraded it to a flagrant 2, and suspended Thomas for a game, but only after the damage and the outrage had already spread. Fever coach Stephanie White said she was glad the league eventually reviewed and punished the play, but questioned why officials didn't catch it live. ESPN, White didn't hold back, calling it disrespectful and saying Clark wasn't being officiated the same way as everyone else, describing the contact to the throat as dangerous. Yardbarker, it wasn't an isolated complaint. Former WNBA star Candace Parker and Lynx coach Cheryl Reeve both pushed back publicly on the physicality, with Reeve backing White's characterization of the missed call as egregious, and saying the league has wanted to avoid the kind of incidents that escalate into full-blown altercations. Yahoo Sports' Parker's take was more layered. She acknowledged that the physicality has always existed in the women's game, but argued that just because her generation endured it doesn't mean this one should have to accept it as the norm. Yahoo Sports, that tension between players who fought for visibility for years without reward and a newer star who arrived already famous, is the undercurrent running through almost everything that's been said since. Why the NBA got pulled in at all, so why would NBA players, men with zero stake in WNBA officiating, start fielding questions about it? Partly because Clark's reach has outgrown her own league's media footprint. Reporters covering NBA media days and locker rooms have been lobbing her name at players who have nothing to do with the WNBA, almost as a culture temperature check. And the answers, intentionally or not, have started reading like statements. Pascal Siakam is a good example of how that played out. He's not someone who chases attention, and when asked a fairly soft question about who gets the most love in basketball right now, he didn't reach for an easy, forgettable answer. By most accounts of how that exchange has been described, he pointed to Clark and notably ranked her affection above that of his own teammate, Tyrese Halliburton, one of the more marketable guards in the NBA. Whether or not every detail of that exchange circulated exactly as reported, the larger point landed. A finals-level player suggesting that a second-year WNBA guard commands more public affection than an NBA All-Star is not a small thing to say out loud. Once that kind of comment is out there, it tends to open the door for others. Players who don't normally do long, reflective answers, guys known more for highlight reel energy than sound bites, have reportedly started talking about Clark less like a guest star and more like a peer, describing mutual admiration between locker rooms rather than a one-way compliment. That shift in language matters. There's a real difference between an NBA player offering Clark a polite shout-out and an NBA player describing her as someone his team watches and feeds off of, the way teams watch each other. One frames her as outside the conversation. The other puts her inside it. Halliburton's vantage point. Tyrese Halliburton occupies an interesting seat in all this. He plays in Indianapolis, the same city Clark calls home, and has crossed paths with her enough to speak with some first-hand authority rather than from a distance. General shape of what's been attributed to him is that he ranks her among the most recognizable active basketball players on the planet, full stop, not most recognizable woman in basketball, but in the same breath as the actual biggest names in the sport, NBA included. That's a striking claim if accurate, putting her cultural footprint in rarefied territory. What's been described as the more interesting part of that comment isn't the ranking itself, it's the empathy underneath it. Reports suggest he also spoke to the noise that follows her, the relentless scrutiny she has no real control over, and the composure it takes to operate inside that pressure without visibly cracking. That's a different register than basketball praise. It reads more like someone naming what she's carrying, which is notable because it's a kind of acknowledgement her own league's public-facing voices have been comparatively slow to offer. LeBron's framing. Infrastructure, not just talent when LeBron James comments on anything. It tends to get treated as more than just an opinion, partly because so much of his own career has played out under exactly the kind of relentless scrutiny he's pointed to in Clark's situation. He has reportedly drawn that parallel directly, noting that people are watching for her to slip, looking for any clip to spin negatively, and that he recognizes that pattern because he lived it himself for 2 decades. The more substantive point attributed to him is about the WNBA's move to chartered flights, which began during Clark's rookie season, a genuine, well-documented operational shift for the league. Framing that change as something tied to her arrival isn't really a compliment about her jump shot. It's crediting her with reshaping the league's actual infrastructure, the kind of impact usually reserved for legacy-defining figures. Whether or not the framing came through in exactly those words, the underlying fact, the charter shift happening alongside her rise, is real and has been widely reported. Trae Young's challenge, and his respect. Trae Young is not someone who shies away from confidence on a basketball court. So when the idea of a 3-point contest between him and Clark came up, the willingness to say yes wasn't surprising. What stood out more was the basketball trivia reportedly attached to it. The two of them are said to be among a very small group of NCAA Division I players, men's or women's, who led the country in both points and assists in the same season. That's an unusual, specific stat to have on recall, and the fact that it surfaced in that context suggests genuine respect for what she accomplished at the college level, not just a media-friendly nod. The detail that's been framed as most revealing is Young allegedly admitting he'd actually need to sharpen up before taking that contest seriously. That's not the kind of thing players say about someone they view as a lesser competitor. It reads as an acknowledgement, startling, for someone with Young's confidence, that the matchup wouldn't be a guaranteed win. Paul George's more complicated answer. Paul George's reported comments stand out for going somewhere most of the conversation hasn't. Instead of just praising Clark, he reportedly tried to contextualize the resentment that exists around her rise. The throughline of that argument is familiar to anyone who's followed the league closely. That there's a generation of WNBA veterans who played in front of sparse crowds for years, who pushed for things like charter flights and better pay long before they arrived, and who watched a lot of that progress materialize almost overnight once a high-profile rookie showed up. That's not a knock on Clark specifically. Nothing about her getting attention is her fault, and nothing about being a beneficiary of timing makes someone undeserving. But it's also true that some of the friction in how she's been guarded on the court has been connected, by various analysts and former players, to that broader frustration about who gets recognized and when. As one columnist who has covered Clark for 3 years put it, the public narrative around her gets flattened into 2 oversimplified stories. Either that the league is uniformly stacked against her, or that the criticism of her treatment ignores discrimination her peers have separately faced, when the actual texture of the situation is much messier than either narrative allows. The Ringer, that messiness is exactly what reporting attributed to George seems to be gesturing at. You can fully recognize Clark's brilliance and still understand why some players find this moment complicated. Luka's blunt 2 words. Luka Doncic has a well-earned reputation for not performing for cameras. He tends to just answer the question in front of him. Reportedly asked who his favorite women's basketball player was, the answer attributed to him was simply Caitlin Clark, with no elaboration. When a follow-up tried to redirect toward college star Paige Bueckers, the reported response was dismissive but not unkind, something to the effect that he hadn't really watched her play at the professional level yet. If accurate, that's less a snub of Bueckers and more a statement about what Doncic apparently values: production at the highest level of competition, not potential. It's the kind of answer that doesn't require any political calculation, which is part of why, true or not in its exact wording, it circulated the way it did. It read as unscripted. Curry's technical praise, with a caveat on sourcing a specific quote, has circulated widely online, attributing to Stephen Curry a statement that he was tired of watching Clark get hit and wanted the league to do more to protect her. That exact line has not been independently verified, and it's worth being upfront about that rather than repeating it as confirmed fact. What is better documented is that Curry has been one of her more consistent public supporters and has offered detailed, technical praise of her shooting mechanics, including comparisons between her release and his own. That's a meaningful comparison coming from someone widely regarded as the best shooter the sport has produced. It's not just a feel-good compliment. It's one shooter recognizing his own mechanics in someone else's game. That relationship has gone both directions. Clark publicly stuck up for Curry on social media earlier this year when he was getting held and grabbed by Charlotte's defense, telling people to let him play. The parallel wasn't lost on anyone watching. She was describing her own situation as much as his. Tatum and Durant. The other side of the ledger, not every NBA name lined up the same way, and that's part of what makes this a genuine split rather than a one-sided wave of support. Jason Tatum, when reportedly asked about his favorite WNBA player, picked Aja Wilson, a completely defensible answer given Wilson's championship resume and MVP-level production. There's nothing wrong with that pick on its own merits. What's drawn attention is less the choice itself and more what it didn't include. No mention of Clark, no acknowledgement of the player currently driving the league's visibility numbers. In a media environment where every answer gets parsed, the absence became its own kind of talking point, fairly or not. Kevin Durant's reported answer carried a similar undertone. Asked which female athlete he was following most closely, the name attributed to him was Angel Reese, a player who has, since their college days, positioned herself in the public eye as something of a foil to Clark. Durant has a large enough platform that picking Reese in that specific moment landed as a deliberate cultural statement rather than a neutral basketball opinion, at least in how it's been covered. None of this should be read as a slight against Reese, who has real talent and a real fan base in her own right. But the optics, combined with Tatum's answer, created the appearance of a dividing line. What the actual on-court reality looks like right now, it's worth separating the symbolic NBA commentary from what's actually happening to Clark on the floor, because that part isn't speculative. Clark has dealt with aggressive, sometimes borderline physical defense throughout her WNBA career, and a recent video compilation of contact from Alyssa Thomas, including a knee near the groin, a pinch under the arm, and a near stomp, renewed public calls for stricter officiating. Total Pro Sports, the pattern has been serious enough that former players and analysts, including former WNBA guard Stacey Dales, have publicly called for suspensions when contact like a hand to the neck goes unreviewed in real time. Yahoo Sports, reactions to how the Fever and Clark herself should respond have varied. NBA Hall of Famer Robert Horry suggested Clark should stop appealing to referees so often and instead start protecting herself physically on the floor, pointing to Shaquille O'Neal's career as the model. When O'Neal got hit too often, he eventually started hitting back within the rules rather than waiting on officials. Yardbarker, others have pushed in the opposite direction, arguing the burden shouldn't be on a 23-year-old guard to police her own safety when the league has officiating tools available to do it for her. Why this all matters more than a string of quotes step back from any individual comment, verified or not, and the larger pattern is real regardless. NBA players who have no professional reason to comment on the WNBA have been doing so anyway repeatedly in ways that read as choosing sides. That's unusual. Athletes in one league typically stay out of another league's internal business. There's no upside to it, and plenty of downside if a comment gets twisted into a headline. The fact that so many have weighed in regardless suggests Clark's visibility has outgrown the normal boundaries between leagues. It also reflects something less flattering, a sense among some observers that the WNBA's own institutional voices, the league office, the officiating crews, the broader public messaging, have been slower to address the physicality directed at its most marketable player than outside commentators have been. As one writer who covers the league closely framed it, the core problem isn't the physical play itself, or Clark's reactions to it, or even the bad faith actors looking to manufacture outrage. The deeper issue is a trust gap, where the league's response consistently seems to lag behind what's obvious to everyone watching. The ringer, that gap is exactly what gave outside voices room to fill the silence. Whether it was Halliburton naming the toll of the scrutiny, LeBron tying her arrival to a literal infrastructure shift, or Paul George trying to explain the resentment without dismissing either side of it. Those comments existed because something wasn't being said clearly enough inside the WNBA's own structure. And the answers that didn't mention her at all, Totems, Durance, carried weight for the same reason. In a moment this loud, choosing not to engage reads as its own kind of position. The bigger picture, what makes this moment different from a typical hype cycle, is that Clark isn't just receiving attention anymore. She's forcing people who don't have to engage with her at all to make a choice about whether they will. That's a strange kind of gravity for a second-year player to have, and it cuts across categories that don't usually intersect this directly. Officiating standards, generational resentment inside a single league, marketing economics, and the broader question of how much physical contact is acceptable before a sport's authorities are obligated to step in. None of that resolves cleanly. The on-court incidents are documented and ongoing. The suspension of Alyssa Thomas this week is proof the league can act, even if critics argue it acts too late and too rarely. The NBA commentary, real or partially embellished in how it's circulated online, reflects a genuine split in how basketball's biggest stars are choosing to talk about her. And the deeper tension Paul George reportedly pointed to between a star who arrived already famous and a generation of players who built the league without that head start isn't something a single suspension or a single supportive quote is going to settle. What does seem clear is that the question driving all of this isn't really about Caitlin Clark anymore. It's about whether the WNBA's own institutions can move at the speed her popularity has already reached, or whether outside voices, NBA stars, sports columnists, former players, will keep filling that gap instead. The following season. The Hoop Doctors, of the 24 WNBA broadcasts that drew at least 1 million viewers in 2024, 21 of them involved Clark, and all 3 games that drew more than 20,000 fans in arena involved the Fever specifically. NBC News, that viewership translated directly into league infrastructure and finances, which is the actual documented version of the "she changed the operations of the entire league" claim that's been circulating in less precise form. The league signed an 11-year, $2.2 billion media rights deal with Disney, NBC Universal, and Amazon beginning in the 2026 season, more than tripling its previous annual media revenue, in the broadcast window immediately following Clark's record-breaking debut season. DC Report.org, analysts have explicitly tied the timing of expanded charter flight access for WNBA teams to the surge in attention and all-star voting Clark generated. She pulled in 1.29 million all-star votes in a single year, the most in league history. The Hoop Doctors, merchandise sales tied to the league, jumped more than 500% year-over-year by one major retailer's count, and a separate retailer reported a 233% increase in WNBA sales specifically. Sports Illustrated, and then there's the pay gap, which is probably the single most cited number in this entire conversation, because it captures the disconnect so cleanly. Clark's 2025 base salary, after a raise, sat at $78,000, while 99% of her actual annual income came from endorsements, headlined by an 8-year, $28 million deal with Nike. Sports Illustrated. Her own agent told ESPN it would be functionally impossible to pay Clark anywhere near what she's actually worth to the league under the current collective bargaining structure, which is part of why the players' union opted out of its agreement and headed into renegotiation, hoping the new media money would translate into significantly higher player salaries league-wide. NBC News, that gap is important context for the resentment conversation because it cuts in a direction that complicates the simplest version of the "veterans are jealous" narrative. Clark herself isn't the one capturing the windfall her popularity created. The league and its broadcast partners are, at least under the deal structure that existed when this controversy was unfolding. Several of her own teammates and rivals around the league are earning contracts well above her own, since rookie-scale deals are fixed regardless of marketing impact, meaning Clark doesn't even rank in the top 50 highest-paid players in the WNBA by contract value despite the outsized attention she draws. Basketball insiders. If there's a villain in the pay equity half of this story, the data points more toward the league's compensation structure than toward Clark personally pocketing an unfair windfall. Though the perception gap between her visibility and her veteran peers' visibility remains the emotional core of a lot of the friction described by people like Paul George and Candace Parker. What's actually verified about the NBA commentary, and what isn't, this is the part that deserves the most caution, because a lot of what's circulated online this season blends real, on-record statements with looser, less sourced characterizations, and at least one widely shared quote, the one attributing to Stephen Curry a direct statement that he was sick of watching Clark get hit and wanted the league to step up, does not appear to be independently verifiable in its exact wording. The honest version of that story is that Curry has been a consistent, vocal public supporter of Clark, including detailed technical praise comparing her shooting release to his own, and that the relationship has gone both directions, with Clark publicly defending him on social media when he faced rough physical defense from Charlotte earlier this year. The more dramatic warning to the league, phrasing attributed to him, should be treated as unconfirmed online amplification rather than a settled fact, and that distinction matters if the goal is accuracy rather than virality. The same caution applies to specific lines attributed to Pascal Siakam, Tyrese Halliburton, LeBron James, Trae Young, Paul George, Luka Doncic, Jason Tatum, and Kevin Durant in various viral breakdowns of this storyline. Some of these are likely rooted in real interview moments that got compressed, paraphrased, or embellished as they spread. Others may be closer to invented or speculative framing, dressed up as direct quotation. Without being able to trace each one back to a verifiable, on-record source, the responsible move is to treat the overall pattern, that NBA players have been getting asked about Clark, and that their answers have varied in tone from warmly supportive to conspicuously absent, as the real story, rather than presenting any specific line as confirmed dialogue from a named athlete. What is independently documented is the on-court reality those comments were responding to, and the range of opinion among people whose statements are actually on record. NBA Hall of Famer Robert Horry, speaking to Fox News Digital, said he believes Clark has spent enough time pleading with officials and should start asserting herself more physically, pointing to Shaquille O'Neal as a model. O'Neal, he said, eventually started elbowing back rather than waiting for the whistle once he got tired of absorbing hits. Yardbarker Horry's broader point was that when you're the best player on the floor, everyone is coming for you, and the response has to include some self-protection rather than relying entirely on the referees. Yardbarker, that's a real, sourced perspective, distinct from the unverifiable Curry quote, and notably it argues almost the opposite position, putting more responsibility on Clark rather than calling for the league to step in on her behalf. Fox News' opinion desk took a similarly blunt stance after the Thomas incident, arguing that if the WNBA won't defend Clark institutionally, she should start defending herself within the rules, framing it as the rest of the league having taken its gloves off already. Yardbarker, that's commentary, not a player quote, but it reflects the same tension running through the documented player reactions. A real disagreement about whether the fix here is better officiating, tougher self-defense from Clark, or some mix of both. Why the institutional gap matters more than any single quote. Strip away the unverifiable viral quotes, and what's left is still a real, documented story. A generational talent whose economic impact on her league is measurable in the hundreds of millions of dollars, facing a pattern of physical contact serious enough that her own coach has called it dangerous and disrespectful on the record, with a league office that reacts after the fact through video review rather than catching the moments live. Even White's praise for the league's retroactive Thomas suspension came wrapped in a complaint that these are things officials simply cannot afford to miss in real time, and that the league has to be better at catching them as they happen rather than relying on outrage cycles to trigger a second look. ESPN, that institutional lag is, in a sense, the actual vacuum that outside commentary, verified or not, has rushed in to fill. When a league's own structures move slower than the public conversation around its biggest star, other voices end up filling that space, for better or worse. Some with genuine empathy and basketball insight, some with agenda-driven framing, and increasingly, some with quotes of uncertain origin that spread real. Yahoo Sports, what's still unsettled is whether the WNBA's own institutions, officiating standards, disciplinary consistency, public messaging, can close the gap between how fast this story moves online and how slowly the league has historically responded to it. That gap, more than any single player's comment about her, real or rumored, is the actual story here.
Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a video.